you could read this in a sense as a kind of trauma narrative.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting in Greene how trauma and faith are sort of joined, and it's not particularly this one. And why I say that with this is that you see somebody who's trying to write through loss, who's trying to write through the trauma. And you see him rewriting. And that's my argument, is that what we're seeing is Bendrix in the act of rewriting something he'd already had his mind made up about. He's changing his mind.
My friends, welcome to The Literary Catholic, a program where we unpack life-changing stories from centuries of Catholic literature, connecting you to God and inspiring both your faith and imagination.
Thank you very much, Bishop. It's always a pleasure to do this. Actually, a lot of fun. Let me explain what we're doing. What we're not doing, first of all, is creating spoilers for our cheat sheets for great literature, making it easy for you. We really want you to read this book, but we're also not proselytizing or trying to get people to become Catholic who aren't Catholic. What we are doing, what we hope to do, is to stimulate your reading of profound literature, and in this case, Catholic-based, to help you better appreciate the rich nuances of our incredible religion and how it has affected the world and lives forever. And it's a very special experience. And the one we're going to be doing today, the book we're going to be talking about today is, and I know this is a classic because I went to the library to get it, and I said, I'd like to get Graham Greene's The End of the Affair. And they said, oh, it's upstairs in the classics department. So I said, wow, this is a classic. I had not read it. And Mary Jane Wood, who asked me to read it, I was a little surprised because this is a pretty hot book. So at any rate, I did read it, and I really have to say I enjoyed it. But the only way to get full enjoyment is kind of what I think we're doing now, and that is talk to really informed and interesting scholars about things like this book. And I happen to have two with me today from Sacred Heart University. One is Professor Peter Sinclair, a man whose class I've always wanted to take. We had a lot of fun with him on our last book, Brideshead Revisited. And he brought a colleague, Professor Brent Little, who's an associate professor of Catholic Studies here at Sacred Heart. By the way, an author himself just came out with a book called Acts of Faith and Imagination. Haven't read it, but that might be a good one to talk about too. So, gentlemen, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is this? Let's start by talking about Graham Greene himself. This book was written in the 1950s, came out in 1951. Is it a autobiography, do you think? Because a lot of his personal life parallels some of this stuff.
Well, Graham Greene himself always resisted the notion that this novel was autobiographical. However, it is hard, it's difficult not to connect the novel with his relationship with Catherine Walston. He dedicates the novel to Catherine Walston. And Greene had many mistresses in his life, and she was one of them, who was married to one of the wealthiest men in England, big landowner, Harry, I think his name was, Walston. And she ended the affair, and Greene was pretty broken by it. They'd been together a long time. And Catherine Walston herself was a Catholic.
And Greene was not, by the way. Greene was a Catholic convert.
He was a convert, and so Greene is a fascinating. Greene's a fascinating figure, and you can find numerous biographies on Greene, and people just go down a rabbit hole with Greene. Just look at Norman Cherry's collection of his biographies, just down to the detail of what Greene ate every morning. It gets kind of crazy, and after you read them, actually you. Happy you never met Graham Greene himself, but despite how much I loved his novels.
Books, yeah.
But he converted, I believe it was in 1926, because he was in love with Vivian Browning, who was a Catholic and refused to marry Greene unless he became a Catholic. Greene considered himself an atheist and an agnostic. He went through instruction with somebody, I believe Father Trollope was his name, of all names. And he did battle with this priest, it's similar in the affair where the character Smith is trying to, as on a sort of crusade, to, draw the belief out of people. And then in the end starts to, like Bendrix, feel like he might be converting belief. Greene assented, essentially, although he hung on to some of his doubts, but he did go through the instruction enough that he became officially a Catholic. So he was a Catholic, but it was always, you can see it in
It was
his
a
Catholic
questioning
novel.
Catholic.
Oh, yes.
Very much so.
He himself, in his own writing, in his autobiographies and in his essays, would often say that that belief to him was meaningless without doubt.
Yeah.
That one must always think of it as like a chessboard in which you have the white squares and the black squares, and one must always be able to stand on the black or the white square. You have to be in a position of doubt and a position of sort of belief. Greene himself went through phases with his Catholicism. He even started calling himself Catholic agnostic, Catholic atheist, and he called himself a Marxist Catholic. He went through all these, and at the end of his life, it would appear that he grew very close to his faith once again. There's speculation about that. Obviously, we'll talk about it, I'm sure, but the end of the affair is pretty much, although he did write a few more things, was his last serious Catholic novel. He had 4 novels that are classics, that bring Catholicism into his works. I mean, his big breakthrough really was Brighton Rock, because he had always been a writer of mysteries and thrillers. That's where he cut his teeth. And I know one of your questions was this distinction between entertainments and serious novels. And the answer to that is it's kind of a marketing ploy he came up with the publishers, because he did want to be considered like Bendrix, like Ian Forster, somebody who is a serious novelist. Of course he was, but he also wanted to be commercial. So he did write these thrillers.
He must have made a lot of money doing this stuff, too.
It took a while. He still always had to actually work in journalism and other things, because it didn't always bring in the money for him. But he lived well, certainly, in his life. But what he did was, with Brighton Rock, it is a hard-boiled thriller. However, he does something, and it's a classic. It's very unique. It's his first Catholic novel. It's the first one he really brings in a Catholic element. It becomes not just a kind of thriller and a chase and a whodunit and trying to catch the murderer. It also becomes a question of the issue of the salvation of the criminal, and it becomes the criminal feeling God hunting him down. And it's really quite brilliant that he used the thriller genre as a kind of vehicle for theological questions of Catholicism.
Well, that's kind of what again, we're not going to do any spoilers here, but Bendrix, who is the person that might be, in a sense, the stand-in for Greene himself, is the narrator of this and an active part of this story. Brent, tell me, both Bendrix, the Graham Greene kind of writer character, and Sarah, the woman that he had an affair with, who was a married woman to, kind of a distinguished British person. They were both very hard on themselves, and one of the questions I would have is this a way of finding God by being hard on yourself? I mean, was this one a technique?
I think so, and in many ways, but it's more about the search, right? Because I think they're hard on themselves for different reasons. Bendrix at least pretends, we actually talked about this yesterday, he pretends to be a very curmudgeonly character. But with Sarah, I think it's interesting because Bendrix has this great line in the book where he says, it's a shame that she didn't realize just how good of a person she was. That's not a paraphrase. That's not the actual quote, but it's this sense of that Sarah underestimated herself in a lot of ways in the evaluation of Bendrix. So I think it is, but I think the thing to keep in mind there is that while they are hard on themselves, it only happens after events force them into some kind of a deeper self-reflection, right? So it's that sort of Catholic sensibility of grace coming into the world. So it's not that they're. So I just want to kind of qualify what we mean here when we say they're hard on themselves.
One of the things that is seems very Catholic, although of course other religions have it too, and that is miracles. I mean, there are a couple substantial miracles in this book, a book supposedly narrated by a person who's not a believer, and these miracles really got attention. One of the miracles had they all had huge consequences. The first one was there was this bombing, and supposedly Bendrix dies, and Sarah sees him and says, if there's a God, I'll end this affair and you'll bring him to life. Well, in a sense, that is what happened. So, want to talk a little about miracles and how all this fits in here?
This is actually the part, not so much the one you mentioned, but the later ones.
Right. There were two other miracles.
Yes, right.
There's several.
Several, yeah.
They call them coincidences. But they pile up.
Yeah, they pile up.
I'm ready for a miracle.
Me too.
I had a few. I was telling Peter. So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the aspects of the book that can be easily criticized, especially towards the end. And even Greene himself admitted that he wanted the book originally to be longer, like Bendrix conversion, if we can use that word, to be stretched out. So that the miracles didn't kind of pile up, like we've been saying.
And he very much wanted these miracles to be something we could speculate about, because they all could have actionable, reasonable answers to them that are
They could be coincidences.
Supernatural.
Yeah.
However, they seem to be that Sarah somehow, after her death, seems to have affected numerous people, including, of course, Bendrix. And like I've always felt is that there's always this debate: did Bendrix convert or not at the end? I mean, it's ambiguous. I mean, he doesn't become a Catholic at the end of the novel, and at least in his narration. But to me, that debate sort of misses the point that Bendrix has found love, really, in the end. And I was talking with Brent about this. I think one of the aspects of the novel that often gets very marginalized in scholarship and in discussion is Bendrix's relationship with Sarah's husband, Henry.
Yeah, he moved in with him.
They become companions. And Henry is the person that Henry, for all intents and purposes, Henry should resent and hate Bendrix, and vice versa. They're the rivals, but they both somehow recognize, well, the real rival is God, And Sarah brought us together, and Sarah herself prayed that Bendrix would seek out Henry and care for him. It was something she prayed for, and they do. There is a sense. For instance, I think the ending is very important. That Bendrix, who we never see, we get only sort of narration of his physical interactions with Sarah. So it's not gratuitous in the novel. Sarah, though, if you notice, is known for touching people. She touches people. And if you look at the end, Maurice Bendrix touches Henry and affirms, I'm committed to you, essentially. And feels the weight of that love and knows what Henry is going to have to face, because Bendrix himself is realizing God is a real possibility here. So poor Henry doesn't know what he's in for. I'm here for. But there's a love, there's an affirmation that I think that's there, that is the conversion, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's the dramatic irony that you start off with Henry as the rival,
Right.
it then shifts to God. And it's also interesting because when you read Bendrix, he seems such an isolated figure. You hardly hear about his family or previous friends. In fact, it feels like Henry is his first, that we know of as reader, his first true male friendship. And of course, this is ironic, right? Because he was the original rival.
He is similar to, Greene was very influenced by Great Expectations. This is actually why he chose to write in the first person. It was his first novel he wrote in the first person.
Yes.
He was a little scared of writing in the first person, and Great Expectations sort of did that for him. And, you do have the orphan figure in Bendrix who seems a bit homeless.
He does.
And Henry takes him in almost in the end. But so I hear what you're saying with that. Definitely.
Brent, you studied this kind of thing in some of your new work. What is this business of using literature, great literature, and research to look at attempting to come to terms with belief and faith? How do all these things kind of fit together?
Yes.
Is it important that literature like this exists to bring people to faith? At least make them think about it.
Yeah, well, Greene would never claim he was writing apologetics, so let's be very clear to the audience.
I'm sure of that,
He took literature seriously as literature. In that sense, he was like a lot of the great Catholic novelists of the time, Muriel Spark, Flannery O'Connor, etc. But for me, what really was interesting to think about, maybe personally, was the difference between belief and faith. So you get to a point, you can read Bendrix getting to the point where God's existence, he can maybe intellectually come to terms with, but he wants nothing to do with God. And it actually, I don't know necessarily if this was Greene's intention or if he even knew this history, but it actually kind of harkens back to a really deep theological tradition in Thomas Aquinas, of all people. The demons have faith in the sense that they believe that God exists. There's no atheist amongst the demons, but they certainly don't have faith in the virtuous sense, right? And that distinction, and I think we forget that in our culture, that faith is not intellectual belief wholly, right? It's something much more.
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting you bring that up about the demons, because it's Hans von Balthasar who critiqued Greene's works for making evil too beautiful, too alluring, too, I forget how he phrased it, and I love Hans von Balthasar, very inspired me with that novel, but Greene does revel very much in his novels in the sinful, in the bodily, they call it Greenland, actually, scholarship. Yes. The settings are filled with the carnal, with seediness. In fact, we were talking about this is such a unique novel of Graham Greene's, because all of the characters are actually likable. Even Bendrix at the end is likable.
Even Mr. Smith.
It's a very human novel.
Right.
You feel for these characters. I mean, they're not behaving well a lot of the times, but compared to his other novels, like a Captain Segura, there's always figures that are clearly despicable. That are clearly evil, quote unquote. Not in this novel. It's such a almost a mundane novel.
Well, I think the thing that makes this, for me, so powerful, many things do, but one is that everybody here, all of these profound kinds of figures, are all struggling. They're all trying to put it all together.
It's the blitz.
Like we all are. And it's not necessarily we're even struggling with the faith, but we're struggling with life, and what does all this mean? And why am I here? And why is it work? And that's when they fire in a few miracles, because we're all ready for that. I mean, I read a study the other day that said 79% of people in America believe in miracles. So maybe there's something there. There's certainly, I think Catholics usually believe in miracles, don't they? That's part of it.
But there's also something kind of maybe inherent in the human that draws one towards belief. And I was thinking of your recent book, Brent, because I was thinking about how Sarah, who it's clear it is not disdainful of belief. She's just uninterested. However, when that V1 rocket, the buzz bomb, comes soaring in like the grace of God, kind of image there, and explodes the apartment, and she thinks Bendrix is dead. She instinctively goes to the bed like a child and kneels, and prays, And then the same thing happens in what I would consider the pivotal scene in her journal when she affirms the body in the church. The plaster statues. And she's still angry at God and fighting with God. I can't love a vapor, she keeps saying. I can't love something that I can't see. I can't believe in a God that's a vapor. But she does affirm that God is a body. You can't nail a vapor to the cross. A body was nailed to the cross. And what does she do when she leaves the church? Even though she's rejecting the church, she says she does it instinctively. She just remembered it from seeing something in a Spanish movie, I think she claims. And
Tips her.
I think that kind of like, the Lord Marchmain in the Brideshead.
Yes.
And she affirmed. I mean, she baptizes herself, even though she was baptized when she was a child.
It's a rare scene in the sense that Greene is explicitly theological in a way that a lot of times he's not. And I think it's the most incarnational scene, to use that word. In his later book, which some would call his fifth Catholic novel, Monsieur Chiodi, you did get these theological discussions, but for the most part, Greene, the theology works more through, one might say, symbolism or themes. And in that book, the incarnation becomes that scene, I should say, comes front and center. I find it very powerful. I think it's Greene at his most theologically creative, most adept, most sophisticated. It's worth reading the book just for those few pages.
Yeah, do you mind if I just read? Do you mind? I mean, if you don't, you want to cut some of this, that's fine, because I agree with you. It's in her journal. She escapes into the church, and she's not going there to seek a church. She's running into the church because she's upset. And she says, I hated the statues, the crucifix, all the emphasis on the human body. I was trying to escape from the human body and all it needed. I thought I could believe in some kind of God that bore no relation to ourselves, something vague, amorphous, cosmic, to which I had promised something and which had given me something in return, stretching out of the vague into the concrete human life, like a powerful vapor moving among the chairs and walls. One day I too would become part of that vapor. I would escape myself forever. And then I came into the dark church in Park Road, the hideous plaster statues and their complacent faces, and I remembered that they believed in the resurrection of the body I wanted to destroy forever. I had done so much injury with this body. How could I want to preserve any of it for eternity? And suddenly I remembered a phrase of Richard's, the atheist who tries to convert people, about human beings being inventing doctrines to satisfy their desires. And I thought, how wrong he is. If I were to invent a doctrine, it would be that the body was never born again, that it rotted with last year's vermin. So she's coming with this affirmation, and then
you can see this is pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, and then I would read on, but I don't want to take a lot of time. But then she affirms, you can't nail, it's in this passage, you can't nail vapor to the cross. That's Greene. And that's the body. Right. And then it's shortly after that, she's angry about it. She doesn't want to deal with this. She walks out of the church.
Well, what's also really interesting about that scene right after Peter stopped is that she thinks about Bendrix, and she said, could I love him if he did not have...
that was
Yeah. Exactly.
I can't love a vapor that was Maurice.
The very scarred, broken, flawed body of Maurice, that there's something about embodiment, and it's this wonderful theme throughout the novel, that the connection between love of God and love of the human other. And even though maybe it's adultery, and of course that, we can talk about that as a form of mortal sin, but it's that sense of like, you have to kind of go through the experience of sin. It's a very daring theological way of thinking. You have to kind of go through the sin itself to get to God or to recognize God.
It's very Father Lynch.
Yes, exactly.
Are we saying you have to be a terrible sinner to really make
Well, Greene would actually. Greene has, there is a sense of if you want to gain the sense of God, and belief, you also have to become intimate with sin. I mean, he's kind of saying that in a lot of ways.
Well,
I'm not saying it's theologically sound, and that's kind of more your area, but it's kind of what he shows in the novels is that Jesus, we see in the Gospels, Jesus didn't hang around with the good doers. I mean, he hung around with prostitutes, he hung around with tax collectors and murderers.
And the church has always said the church teaching is everybody's a sinner.
Yeah, exactly. I would really look at it against the idea of original sin, right? That sin so saturates the world and destruction.
It certainly does.
Exactly. And so that it's not so much that you have to go off and be a bad person, but just by being human. But just by being human and having these failings.
Yes. I think that's a very well said. Good point. What about, some people say this is the last, you may disagree, Peter, of Greene's Catholic novels, written in published in 1951, before Vatican II. It's interesting, at least to me, there aren't a lot of Catholic-type novels since Vatican II. Did Vatican II so change the church? Or, because pre-Vatican II, it seemed, and I was alive during that period, quite alive, that, the church was much more pious and more mystical and that kind of thing. I like the way the church has become. I'm very happy with it, but it's very different. Maybe, though, there isn't as much rich material for novels in the current church.
Well, I think it depends. I think a lot of this depends on how you define the Catholic novel. And there's a certain generation, let's say Marillac, the great French Catholic novelist, to maybe midpoint Greene or end of Flannery O'Connor's life, or
Marillac
mid-60s Muriel Spark, where that changes and that sort of dramatic narrative where you really have a separation between grace and the secular world, and that collision. I would say, though, there's been many great Catholic novels written since Vatican II, but they are a different kind of Catholic novel. And I would, for example, point at Mary and Ecstasy by Ron Hansen, that it's set up in a different kind of way. Or some of the novels by Alice McDermott, that it's almost, it's not that clear polarity between the secular world and, for lack of a better word, the Catholic world, the world of grace. It's much more intermingled, and it's much more ambiguous.
I was going to say, by the way, this is a giant scholarly debate that's been going on
is it?
now. What is the status?
Well, here
of
we
Catholic
are.
novel?
Yeah, this is exactly right.
What's the status of belief in fiction? And there are some scholars who are saying there is no real work being done in fiction on a level of belief for Catholicism. I disagree, but what I do think changed is that, and you see it, is that when Greene was writing The End of the Affair, and you see this change happen shortly after the 1950s, certainly, and the other novels, you have a real sense of Catholicism being a risk.
Exactly.
Your life is at stake. There is something there's a supernatural quality to this notion that damnation could be real, that these choices have real consequence, that whether or not I choose to believe in God has actual real consequences. And Greene really, that comes out in those novels and other novels at that time, that's the thing that disappears. You don't get the wager as much anymore.
Well, yeah.
The post-Vatican II. And it's kind of because faith has become more like a choice in a way, where it's become more, this is not as much of a risk, I think, in the way it was. These guys were, by the way, converts in England. So, and that was risk to begin with. That was a social
significant
risk.
What about this? We're dancing around a little element of this, and that is, yes, these and the church then in the 1950s and before dealt very heavily with violence, immortality, deceit, desire, all that stuff. It's still, of course, very much there. But now the church itself has shifted a little, quite a bit toward forgiveness, reconciliation, human understanding, gotten more into some of those grayer areas that are equally important, so is that just the way the world is slowly changing?
Well, I think actually Greene prefigures that with this, because I think the end of the affair is you have instances and representations of a great deal of humility and forgiveness. And again, Henry, he seems to be the symbol of forgiveness.
Yeah. The man who's the husband of Sarah, who's forgiving her lover.
Yeah, and I would argue that that's something that, and I know that you write a lot about this, that becomes a model for Bendrix, because Bendrix learns to overcome his egotism, his jealousies, his hatreds, all of these things that he's all I. He even says that in his narration. That's all I'm hearing when I write is I. And I think there's Evil and Waugh would always criticize Greene's writing, although they were friends, that he argued that Greene could never write a beautiful sentence, or he was never, because Waugh was into aesthetic. I know, I do too, but there is a beautiful moment, and I won't read it, but it's near the end of the novel where Bendrix realizes he made Henry uncomfortable when the priest came over, when there's a big argument. It's a beautiful scene. Nobody talks about it either. It's sacramental in its beauty, where Bendrix sees Henry sleeping in his room with the light on, his arm over his head. And obviously Henry is in a great deal of despair. And so Bendrix goes down and gets some biscuits and some milk and puts it by the bed so that it'll be there. If he wakes up to turn off the light, I'm here. The Eucharist, biscuits. James Joyce used the biscuits too, as an image of the Eucharist. But this is it's a sacramental moment. It's reconciliation. It's beautiful. And that's Greene. It's that.
That's interesting.
It's a tender.
You guys are so smart, and you pick up these fabulous subtleties. And I've read it. That's Peter. All those other elements didn't.
It's easy to overlook because you get overwhelmed with the miracles, which I don't think are unimportant at all. The sublime nature of Sarah's conversion and all that, and you get blinded then sometimes to these beautiful gestures that occur.
Well, Peter mentioned this idea of mercy, forgiveness, and one of the great Graham Greene lines is in Brighton Rock, and I won't probably get it word for word perfect, but it's something like, "You can never know the appalling strangeness of the mercy of God."
Yeah,
I think it's just a wonderful.
Only good thing line. A priest says in Graham Greene novel, by the way. Greene has a hard time portraying priests, but go ahead.
Except for Monsieur Security. I love Monsieur.
That's true. No, that's actually wonderful. Sorry.
No, that was really what I was saying. That a lot of, and sometimes the writers, the artists, the novelists are maybe a little bit more creative in their theological thinking compared to the time, right? Because obviously that would not have been something that he would have learned in catechesis, right, when he converted. But it's a beautiful, poetic, and I think true.
Yeah, it is. Well, now, I'm so humbled by you guys. So smart, so well read, and here I am, and I think but this book had some effect on me. Well, what about of all this reading you guys have done over your life and studying? How do books like this book in particular, how does it fit into the great things that you have read and thought about?
Love it. I think it's Greene's best written novel. Maybe too, Quiet American, maybe, I don't know. But
I go with this one.
But it's just so well written. For me, it really has to do with the way that grace is often unlooked for, unseen, and occurs in circumstances that sometimes people might say, oh, well, is Greene saying God causes evil? Did God drop the bomb? Did God cause the war? Yeah. No, it's not that. It's more about the fact that it's more like a Flannery O'Connor-like move, and they were very different people. But it's more like the sense that evil can reveal to a person the necessity of grace.
Yeah.
So it kind of like clears away the blinders. And it's just such a wonderful book to teach, because all these miracles, all these little events like Sarah's prayer. I asked my students when I teach this, is she crazy to even keep her pledge? Because most people would say, it was a time of desperation.
By the way,
right?
there are critics who say the whole thing's ridiculous.
Right, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and what you said was actually beautiful. I love that.
Thank you.
Sarah's, there is a lot of criticism of Sarah making this. She prays and says, I makes a promise with God, and every human has done that in some circumstance.
Sure.
Oh, God, I'll do anything to make this go away. But she keeps her vow, and she hates it, but it leads her to what the novel suggests is a movement from I believe to faith, right? She's it's the real thing. But to answer your question, I think it's Greene's masterpiece. I like,
and
maybe
it is a masterpiece.
And maybe it's a personal to me in that level too. It's unlike any novel Greene wrote. Greene even said, I became French for a little while when I wrote this, because if you read his other novels, they're not quite like this, but it's a beautiful novel. But what I would suggest is it's a novel that demands that you reread it. It has to be reread.
I could see that.
And I'll explain why. Because the novel is about revision. And one thing you have to keep in mind when you're reading this novel is Bendrix is a novelist, and he's telling us, I'm writing something and I'm struggling with it. And he's bringing in I'm a novelist, I'm trying to write this novel. That's the end of the affair. And oh my God, this is hard. I can't do this. And this might sound a little like making the novel a little too contemporary, but I did write about this. It's going to be out in Renascence pretty soon. But you could read this in a sense as a kind of trauma narrative.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting in Greene how trauma and faith are sort of joined, and it's not particularly this one. And why I say that with this is that you see somebody who's trying to write through loss, who's trying to write through the trauma, and you see him rewriting. And that's my argument, is that what we're seeing is Bendrix in the act of rewriting something he'd already had his mind made up about. He's changing his mind. And so what you get is Sarah's voice. And we forget about that. It's not just first person. You get Sarah, a big chunk of it, where he just transcribes the journal
diary
in there that he almost destroyed, that he, sort of fiendishly, I would argue, kept hidden from everybody, but now obviously he doesn't. So that's another sign that he's got some reconciliation or forgiveness, in a sense. Yes. And so whenever I reread this, I think to myself, we're reading the act of revision here. That as he keeps going back, and he's got to, because he says in the beginning, a novel does not have a famous opening.
Exactly.
A novel does not have a beginning or end. One arbitrarily chooses the moment of experience in which to look back from and which to look ahead. And literally that's kind of what a trauma narrative is like. He's in a sort of an inertia between the future and the past. And I would argue that it doesn't affirm, like Evil and Wa does, that Charles has converted. It doesn't confirm that at the end, because the story doesn't end. He's still revising.
Right.
That's a one. I'm glad that was so beautifully stated, Peter. And I the thing I like about Greene versus, say, Brideshead Revisited is the conversions are they're messier. One might say.
I love. I was going to say it's messy.
It's
this is messy stuff.
So Sarah,
dramatic.
So Sarah's actions, even after she has faith, you could question the intelligence of some of them, right? But even something like the other great Catholic novel by Greene, Power and the Glory, where the priest just cannot see the mercy of God, or the fact that forgiveness is offered to him. I mean, and the reader has to tease it out.
While he carries his altar stone.
It's exactly right. The reader at the very end has to tease it. I mean, but I think what Peter just said, I mean, I love The Power and Glory, and I think every Catholic should read The Power and the Glory. But what Peter just said about the narrative, the construction of the narrative at the end of the affair, gives this novel, I think, an additional complexity that his other Catholic novels, which are much more linear, lack. And that's not criticism of them. That's just an observation.
Yeah, and I'm a scholar of Graham Greene, and trust me, I've had to map out many times the chronology here because it jumps around.
Just like memory does. Just like
memory.
You certainly are a scholar. I saw your notes. My gosh, I've never seen that.
And I like to what you were saying. Yeah, I mean, you can. Sarah's actions are very questionable. Afterwards, she does. Like I said, she makes her vow that she will not sleep with Bendrix. But she says, like, to God, that doesn't mean I can't sleep with that.
Exactly.
And it's like, ooh.
Exactly.
Now, listen, I say to you, isn't this fun talking to such smart and interesting people? And I wonder, and I also think about your students. That's my last question. These students are very lucky here at Sacred Heart to have you folks as professors. But when I read this, I said, what a waste this book is on students. I mean, I'm much older, and now I'm starting to appreciate, with all this life experience I've had, it seems like it'd be really a waste on a 20-year-old compared to somebody like me who's lived a full life. How do your students, how do they react to this stuff?
I used to teach. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Please go ahead.
The Power and the Glory in class, and like I said, I love that novel. It's one of the great Catholic novels, and everyone should read it. But they connect to this one more, and I think because of the context, the fact that it is an affair. Everyone goes through struggles, right, exactly, and just even the thing like the miracles, that's a question that young adults have to struggle with. When do I read the meaning into things that might just be coincidences? Is God? Are there signs? Are there miracles? And people get really personal about that
students
question.
Love that issue. By the way, they love the issue of about providence, or are there signs from God? And a lot of students tend to associate sometimes faith with, everything has a purpose and a reason, everything that happens kind of thing.
Yes.
So they do love the question of miracles.
Oh, yes.
I've taught this, not every year, but I have taught it. I would say, I don't blame any student for having a hard time. It's a hard first read. Particular student. This is sophisticated work in a way. But, like Brent said, I have known students who have been very moved by this work. When they read it. So,
well, Brent Little, Peter Sinclair, what a joy it is to be with both of you, and thank you for joining us. And we didn't give away too much. There's a lot in this book that you'll now have to read. The End of the Affair, Graham Greene. Thank you. I hope we get together again, and I hope I get to sit in one of your classes.
Well, thank you.
And thank you. You're welcome. I enjoyed this very much.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.